If you ask the average American to name the bloodiest day in their nation's history, they will usually give you one of three answers: September 11th, 2001, D-Day, or the Battle of Gettysburg. They are all wrong. On a single, sweltering Wednesday in western Maryland, near a quiet farming village named Sharpsburg, more Americans fell in battle than on any other day in history. In just 12 hours of combat, over 22,700 men were killed, wounded, or went missing. To put that into perspective, more American soldiers died on this single day than at D-Day, Pearl Harbor, and 9/11 combined. We are taught in school that this battle, the Battle of Antietam, was a crucial Union victory. We're told it was the moment Abraham Lincoln finally gained the leverage to issue the Emancipation Proclamation and change the moral arc of the Civil War. But what the history books leave out is the absolute stomach-churning horror of how that day actually played out. It was a nightmare spawned by one of the greatest intelligence blunders in military history. It was fought by teenagers who choked on their own gun smoke, butchered by primitive medicine, and left to rot in 85-degree heat while two generals argued over who lost less. Today, we are looking past the heroic statues and the textbook maps. This is the story of the day America ran out of graves, and why the single deadliest day in American history was far worse than you think. To understand how 100,000 men ended up trapped in a slaughterhouse, you have to look at September 1862. The Confederacy was winning. General Robert E. Lee had just crushed Union forces at Second Bull Run. The North was demoralized, Lincoln's political support was collapsing, and British and French diplomats were watching closely, waiting for one final, decisive Southern victory on Northern soil before officially recognizing the Confederacy as an independent nation. Lee took the ultimate gamble. He marched his ragged, barefoot army of Northern Virginia across the Potomac River into Maryland. His goals were simple: feed his starving army on Northern crops, threaten Washington, D.C., and force a peace treaty before the winter of 1862. Then, divine intervention handed the Union the key to ending the war in an afternoon. On September 13th, for days before the battle, a Union corporal named Barton Mitchell was resting in a meadow near Frederick, Maryland, that had just been vacated by Southern troops. In the grass, he spotted an envelope containing 3 cigars wrapped in a sheet of paper. That paper wasn't scrap. It was Special Order 191, Robert E. Lee's entire, highly detailed battle plan. It revealed the ultimate tactical vulnerability. Lee had split his small army into 4 isolated columns to capture Harper's Ferry. They were separated by miles of mountainous terrain. If the Union Army moved immediately, they could crush Lee's divided forces piece by piece and end the Civil War in a matter of days. When the document reached Union Commander General George B. McClellan, he was ecstatic. He held the paper in the air and declared, "Here is a paper with which, if I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I will be willing to go home." So, what did McClellan do with the greatest intelligence stroke in military history? He waited. For 18 agonizing hours, McClellan sat in his tent, second-guessing himself, calling for more reconnaissance, and convincing himself that Lee actually had 150,000 men, when Lee actually had fewer than 40,000. That 18-hour delay gave Lee just enough time to realize his plans had been lost, panic, and desperately order his scattered divisions to march day and night to concentrate at a tiny crossroads town called Sharpsburg, backed up against the Antietam Creek. By the time McClellan finally moved, the trap had unsprung. The stage was set for a slaughter that never should have happened. Dawn. September 17, 1862. 5:30 a.m. The battle opened on the northern edge of the field, on a 40-acre plot of land owned by a farmer named David Miller. The corn stood 6 feet tall, heavy with green stalks. Within 30 minutes, that cornfield became hell on earth. Union Major General Joseph Hooker pushed his First Corps south down the Hagerstown Turnpike directly into the cornfield. Waiting for them inside the stalks were Stonewall Jackson's veteran infantrymen, and neither side could see the other through the heavy morning fog and the tall corn. Men fired blindly at muzzle flashes from less than 30 feet away. The volume of lead was unthinkable. Regiments didn't retreat. They were simply erased. The 1st Texas Infantry entered the cornfield with 226 men. In less than 20 minutes, 186 of them were shot down, an 82% casualty rate, one of the highest single-regiment losses in American history. The artillery on both sides rolled up to the edges of the field and loaded canister shot, essentially giant tin cans packed with solid iron balls that turned cannons into industrial shotguns. When the cannons fired, whole lines of men didn't just fall. They were literally blown to pieces. Union General Joseph Hooker later wrote in his official report, "Every stalk of corn in the northern and greater part of the field was cut as closely as could have been done with a knife, and the slain lay in rows precisely as they had stood in their ranks a few moments before." Graphic overlay showing the timeline of Miller's cornfield from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. Between 6 a.m. and 9 a.m., just 3 hours, control of David Miller's cornfield changed hands 15 different times. 8,000 men fell in that single field. That is roughly 44 casualties every single minute. By 9 a.m., as the smoke cleared slightly over the West Woods, a Union general was shot dead. Another was wounded 3 times, and thousands of teenagers lay dying on ground so saturated with blood that survivors recalled their boots sticking to the dirt. And the battle was only just beginning. As the slaughter in the cornfield ground to a halt from sheer mutual exhaustion, the center of gravity shifted south toward a sunken farm road. For decades, heavy farm wagons had carved this dirt path 3 to 4 feet below the level of the surrounding fields. To the 2,500 Confederate soldiers under General D.H. Hill who took position inside it, it looked like a gift from God, a ready-made, reinforced trench. They kneeled behind the earthen embankment, rifles rested, and waited. To when Union General William French's division crested the ridge above the road at 9:30 a.m., they had no idea the ditch was there. The Confederates stood up and fired a simultaneous volley at point-blank range. The entire front rank of the Union force crumpled instantly. For 3 brutal hours, wave after wave of Union troops, including the famed Irish Brigade, marching under their bright green silk flags, charged across the open ridge into a wall of lead. Then, around 1 p.m., a fatal tragedy occurred. A Confederate officer, trying to reposition his brigade to face a flank attack, gave an order to change front to the rear. His men misunderstood the command in the deafening noise and thought it was an order to retreat. Unit by unit, the Confederates abandoned the trench. Union soldiers rushed the high ground and looked down into the road. What they saw shocked even hardened combat veterans. The ditch was filled to the brim with bodies, piled 3 and 4 deep. Blood had pooled at the bottom of the road like a mud puddle. From that afternoon on, the sunken road would forever be known simply as Bloody Lane. At this exact moment, Lee's army was broken. His center was wide open. There were no Confederate reserves left to fill the gap. A vigorous Union push right through Sharpsburg would have cut Lee's army in half and forced its total surrender. Union General Israel Richardson rode back to McClellan, pleading for permission to deploy the 20,000 fresh Union reserve troops sitting idle just across the creek. McClellan refused. Paranoid that Lee was hiding a secret strike force, he held his reserves back. The window closed. Meanwhile, on the southern end of the field, Union General Ambrose Burnside was attempting his own tactical blunder. Ordered to cross Antietam Creek and hit Lee's right flank, Burnside fixated on a narrow, 12-foot-wide stone bridge guarded by just 400 Georgian sharpshooters perched on high bluffs overlooking the crossing. For 3 critical hours, Burnside funneled his men into a narrow bottleneck across that bridge, losing hundreds of soldiers to rifle fire. He didn't need to. The creek in September was barely 2 to 3 feet deep in multiple locations nearby. His men could have simply waded across at almost any point. By the time Burnside finally forced the bridge and threatened to crush Lee's remaining flank at 4 p.m., Confederate General A.P. Hill's division arrived after a heroic 17-mile forced march from Harper's Ferry, many of them wearing captured blue Union uniforms, and hit Burnside's exposed flank, driving them back to the creek. As night fell over Maryland, the firing finally sputtered out. When the sun came up on September 18th, the landscape was unrecognizable. Over 22,000 men lay dead, wounded, or dying across a field less than 6 square miles. The town of Sharpsburg had a civilian population of just 1,300 people. Overnight, every single building, home, barn, church, and porch within 5 miles was converted into a field hospital. A Civil War medicine was unprepared for carnage on this scale. There were only about 500 surgeons present for both armies combined. That meant each doctor was responsible for over 30 critically wounded men. Surgeons worked 48 hours straight without sleep. They didn't understand germ theory. They didn't wash their hands, nor did they sterilize their scalpel blades between patients. They wiped bloody bone saws on their aprons and moved to the next man. Because the soft lead mini-ball ammunition of the era shattered human bone into hundreds of splintered fragments, saving a limb was impossible. Amputation was the only way to prevent fatal gangrene. Piles of severed arms and legs were stacked outside farmhouse windows, reaching heights of 3 to 4 feet. Then came the dead. It was 85 degrees in mid-September. Over 3,600 human bodies and 5,000 dead horses lay rotting under the late summer sun. The smell of decomposition was so suffocating that residents 6 miles away in Gettysburg had to keep their doors and windows nailed shut. The water in local wells was contaminated for months. It took 3 full days just to dig shallow mass graves. Many men were buried with simple wooden boards. Thousands were buried with no name at all. 2 days after the battle, a photographer named Alexander Gardner arrived at Antietam on behalf of famed studio owner Matthew Brady. Up until September 1862, war had been depicted through romantic oil paintings and heroic sketches. Generals looked noble on horses. Soldiers died cleanly with their hands on their hearts. Gardner set up his bulky glass plate cameras and photographed the raw, unedited truth of the battlefield. Bloated corpses with contorted faces, hands frozen in death, mass trenches filled with boys who would never go home. In October 1862, Brady opened an exhibition in New York City titled The Dead of Antietam. Crowds lined up around the block on Broadway. People wept in the gallery. The New York Times wrote a review that echoed across the nation. Mr. Brady has done something to bring home the terrible reality and earnestness of war. If he has not brought bodies and laid them in our dooryards and along streets, he has done something very like it. For the first time in human history, civilians saw war not as a glorious spectacle, but as a mass grave. Strategically, the Battle of Antietam was a draw. On the night of September 18th, Lee slipped his army back across the Potomac into Virginia. McClellan, true to form, did not pursue him. Lincoln was so disgusted by McClellan's failure to destroy Lee's army that he visited the battlefield in person, confronted his general, and fired him 2 months later. Yet, because Lee had been forced to abandon his invasion of the North, Lincoln claimed Antietam as the political victory he desperately needed. 5 days later, on September 22, 1862, Lincoln issued the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It transformed the war from a constitutional struggle to preserve a union into a crusade to destroy human slavery. It permanently blocked Great Britain and France from recognizing the Confederacy, ensuring the South would have to fight a long war of attrition it could never win. The Battle of Antietam saved the nation, but it did so at a cost that modern minds can scarcely comprehend. The next time you look at the peaceful, rolling hills of western Maryland today, remember what lies beneath the grass. Remember the 3 cigars. Remember the mowed corn. Remember the trench filled with blood. And remember the day that America nearly bled to death in a single afternoon.